Morning, everybody. I am Bob Sanborn, President and CEO of Children at Risk, and welcome to the Future of Children Summit. So we're going to try to, during the next 2 hours, to have some lively discussion on where we're going over the next 5, 10, 50 years with our children. And so we have a lot of good topics to talk about. And every year we try to do this Future of Children Summit. And the idea is to have provocative questions to provocative topics around children and the future of children. And so we think we've put together a really nice group of topics. And I want to thank Courtney Maddox, who is the coordinator of all these summits that we do at Children at Risk and Texas Family Leadership Council. Thank her for the great work that she's done on this today, and the whole team at Children at Risk. And as I mentioned, this is Children at Risk is also part of the Texas Family Leadership Council, and together we do these summits. And so we want to thank everyone from all over the state of Texas and the country who are here today watching our summit and trying to learn from us. I also want to thank our major sponsor, Corebridge Financial. They've been a great sponsor of Children at Risks over the years, and we want to thank them for their continuing support. And to our regular partners that are here for today, Our Turn, Early Learning Alliance, the Santa Maria Hostel, the Children's Defense Fund, Quiet Rebel, the Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center. We're excited to have them here. Green Space Learning and Molina Healthcare. All of those are our big partners today. Throughout the event, we'll try to drop interesting things into the chat box. You should also try to do questions if you can. I'm not going to do a big intro for each of our speakers because the bios, you have access to the bios, and they'll be also dropped into the chat box. What we'll try to do is each session is about 11 minutes long, and my camera will pop up at the end of those. I'll ask a question or two, depending upon what we have and how much time we have. But we're keeping everything to 11 minutes, so it moves along quickly. If you're bored, just wait a couple minutes. We'll have another speaker, and it'll be exciting. But I don't think anyone's going to be bored today at all, based upon the lineup that we have. So let's get right into it. First up, I'm real excited to bring Nicola Springer here. Nicola is the Executive VP and Director of Pre-K to 12 Projects at Kirksey Architecture. And Nicola has done these Future Children Summits over the years many, many times. And there she is. Nicola, you doing well today?
Yes, I am. I'm very excited to be here, Bob.
Very good, very good. And what I love about Nicola's presentation is the plethora of really interesting slides. So take us away. I want to ask some questions, some hard-hitting questions, of course, Nicola, at the end. But take it away and give people an idea of what the future holds for schools and architecture. Take it away, Nicola.
All right. Thank you, Bob. So today we're talking about design and how it really can influence the possibilities in school. And for me, the future as well. It is welcoming of the spirit. We're really going to look at how we can design for the well-being of the mind and the body and wellness and health of students. When we think about schools, or when you think about schools, you're definitely thinking about how to make sure your kids are smart, make sure that they're getting the right social and emotional learning, and making sure that they are able to adapt. And if COVID has told us anything, you really need to be adapt and be gritty and resilient. And we do the same thing with the schools. We want to make sure they're smart, using our resources. We want to make sure they're welcoming and safe places for kids to be. And we want to make sure that they can pivot with a very quickly changing times. We want to make sure that also that we're thinking about the way that you're going to be using these schools and the way that you're going to be learning and creating spaces that facilitate that. We also want to make sure the future is talking about how do we make sure that we engage the community and we are inclusive with all users and getting from them their ideas about how they want to use their space. And even more importantly, making sure that we are including our future leaders, the ones that are going to be using the space. They're our most important clients. And that client right now, we're currently in Generation Alpha, and these kids are living in a world that's so different from some of us who are talking today. They're the most visible generation. They've been on screen since they were babies. If you think about the sonograms that people send out and their gender reveals, They are truly digital natives. They don't know what to do if their iPod or iPad's not in their hand, but they're also very concerned and aware of all the things that are happening around them. They're just so much more globally aware. And when we think about them, we want to make sure that we're creating spaces that we're designing for their whole bodies, their whole minds, and really making them feel that they're integrated. So starting off with welcoming spirit, and that's just the front door, and how we encourage and make people excited about coming in. We are in tough times these days where those entries are subject to hardening and things like that. But I want to say that we can still create very engaging and welcoming spaces without turning them into the, the hardened sort of wall spaces that we've seen. And then also making sure that when you come into these spaces, you are excited, you can find personalization, you can find aspects about your community. And just being welcoming and opening. This particular image, this is where the principal greets her students in the morning every day. They're excited to come in and the world is before them. Buildings also welcoming by the way they integrate into the landscape of the neighboring community. And again, drawing people in, making them excited about what's going to happen today, but also still being able to be safe by the way that you plan and cleverly close off spaces. So well-being of mind. And in this generation, one of the things that we're really trying to do is sort of kind of create smaller learning communities. Our schools have gotten so big. And the goal is, we only know, like, you can only recognize so many people at a time. So how do you make sure that you keep those small communities, integrate physical activity and art, find those quiet spaces, and make the building work with you to teach? So planning is really important. And you're going to see that we're designing much more around smaller communities, pods of classrooms, creating collaboration zones, but also distributing administration so that there's always adults somewhere nearby. Having access to daylight and views. We all know that learning is done better when you can see what's happening outside. It lifts the spirit to be able to see the day change, and it really helps center you when you know what you're doing. Acoustics, storytelling in architecture is really important, really to engage the students and keep them excited about these spaces. And as I said, integrating physical activity, having art and creative expression, being part of the space really inspires kids. And then when you get to the classroom, the idea of designing for all sizes and all shapes and all different types of learners, and incorporating into that classroom no longer the rows, but having different furniture, different movements, and incorporating quiet zones and reading zones, and making sure that every student can find their space. And we're always very excited about designing buildings that can contribute to the learning process and really showcase for the students, whether it's around architecture or science or the environment, the ways that buildings can continue to teach and inspire them and allow them to experiment and discover. And then, as I mentioned, with how stressful things are these days, making sure that we're incorporating spaces where not only students, but adults can relax and separate themselves and calm themselves down, really important to integrating into our design. And then with the wellness of body, our outdoor spaces of learning are just as important as our indoor spaces. Play is happening on the inside and play is happening on the outside because play is integral to how we learn, but also maintaining and creating those environments so that they're comfortable, so that they're shaded, so that they can be utilized as a second space and zone for students to move from one side of the campus to the other with that integrated physical activity. And incorporating porches and outdoor learning areas that, especially in our climate, can cool the space, that will keep students cool, but still allow them to go outside. And I think, again, as you guys remember with COVID, really was important that these outdoor spaces were part of the learning environment. And students really do appreciate being outside, because at the end of the day, we do need to remember that they are kids, and they're human, and their bodies are growing, and they're excited about learning. And we want to make sure that they enjoy themselves while they're in these spaces. And that joy of learning will transfer through when the spaces that they're learning in are really contributing to the way that they learn and the way they interact with each other and their communities. And so with that, I probably went faster than Dr. Bob was expecting, but I am ready for questions about what the future of childhood education buildings looks like.
So Nicola, I always love these photos, right? Because you give us a nice idea of some of the possibilities. Yeah. But I think about today, and there seem to be two competing trends that I see, certainly in Texas, but I think this is true around the country, is that one of the things that we see is we have a state legislature that keeps saying, harden the schools, make the schools safer. And frankly, right, teachers and superintendents, they get this idea. We're all scared of school shootings. How do we make these buildings sort of harden? At the same time, another trend is when I look across the state of Texas, where the vast majority of our kids are Latino. And the way Latino families like to engage in the school is that those families like to come to the school as a community center. Moms like to have lunch or breakfast with the kids. So how, as an architect, do you put those two things together, the pressure to harden, or maybe you don't succumb to that pressure, and the pressure to make the school a real community center?
Right. And this is right up with the ideas around design, right? So first thing I want to say is that when we understand these days that we're saying that it's mental health that's an issue, when we design schools like what I just showed you, that is going to help improve the mental health. Imagine walking into a school that feels like a jail. We're just perpetuating the issues into the next generation. But we as architects have to be clever enough to make sure that we understand how we can create those spaces. How do you create an entry and then make sure that you are reducing or slowing down the process of somebody entering a building? So whether that is the materials you use, whether that is the way that you, the mullions, the point is that you're trying to slow down the process of somebody, but I think you still want these things to be welcoming. And again, it's around planning and things like that, because definitely these families want to be there. And so I think it's about design and understanding that hardening a building does not mean that it turns into a bunker. And all these buildings are designed to be safe. The glass, whether it is with some sort of film or the way that you create zones so that people can't necessarily access the buildings immediately, that's what you do. But you have to work hard to make that happen. But I think primary is if you need to make the buildings welcoming for all the days that those families are going to be there.
Yeah, you want the families to be engaged. Obviously, that's it. You want this to be a community center.
Yeah.
The other question I have, Nicola, is that, if you and I were talking 5 years ago, we would never have expected two things. One, we would never expected that people who work in offices now really want to work from home if they can, right? I mean, we never would have expected that. Right. And we wouldn't have expected that we would have been launched into virtual schools for a couple of years. Now, obviously, a lot of it was a failure in terms of student learning, but it doesn't mean we're going to throw that idea out, because there were some successes, right? Absolutely. And we saw success in virtual learning with a lot of kids, not the majority of kids, but a lot of kids. How, as an architect, when you think about a school, and I get that there were schools built 100 years ago, which are still going strong, but when you think about a school 30 years from now, how do you incorporate, and what do you think that might look like in terms of that virtual learning component? And might there be a lot of kids who really do want to learn from home, like the office situation?
Right. I think what COVID did is it gave us the options and the opportunities. One thing we definitely know about the way kids learn, or the way we want education to go, is that you want it to be more customized and personalized. And what that means is, as many kids as they are, there is many ways that you can teach them. And how they are going to be most successful is going to be the most important thing. Some kids are going to feel better about being in a classroom, having that space, having their friends and others are going to feel more comfortable with working with technology. Salman Khan with Khan Academy a few weeks ago gave his great presentation about how, with the use of the computer, how much you can have that personalized learning, but you're still going to need to be in a space. And I think that idea around smaller communities and creating environments where students can find their best spot, that is how the school will continue to grow. Education has always been one of the slow moving parts, the buildings as well. But the incorporation of technology and making sure that works well is going to be important. But designing for the human body, mind, and spirit is still going to be important. I think lots of people realize how much they wanted to get back into spaces. You're going to have, the thing is, things are just, there's more you're going to be able to do. I mean, I know there are virtual reality ideas about creating yourself in a space and things like that, but I think it's things running in parallel, not things being taken away.
There are going to be just as many kids who need to be in a school with other kids, and maybe smaller classes, maybe different classes,
exactly.
But people teachers helping them and people guiding them. I think that's
exactly.
good.
Yes.
Two questions I want to address that came out of the Q&A box. One, I think is very quick. One is, how does the funding happen? You guys can take whatever a school allocates for money in terms of allocation for building a new school, and you're able to do wonderful things with the money allocated by and large. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, typically with public schools, you have your bonds. Those bonds come through property taxes for wherever the school districts are. Most school districts currently put together a series of ed specs or giving you guidelines about what you want to build, the number of classrooms and things like that. And then the architects have opportunities within those guidelines to create what they think and showcases the best learning environment for students. So.
And then the last question, and I hate that we have this question, but it's real, is bulletproof glass. Is that a lot more expensive than regular glass?
Right. So first we're going to say it's not bulletproof, because nothing is bulletproof. Bullets go through the walls, they go through the concrete, and depending on what kind of machine you're using, they will go through lots of things. The important thing is that what you're trying to do in design is slow down the progress of whoever the perpetrator is. And so the film on the glass can stop the glass from breaking through and slow down that person from breaking out the glass and getting in. You put mullions in, you step up, you're slowing them down because they can't just run straight through. And then having, vestibules, which you're seeing a lot of, creating those different locks. Yes, some things are more expensive than others, but it's the difference between building a wall out of CMU and concrete and building it out of chipboard, right? So you're gonna have those issues all the time. It's a balance of things. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We have to ask that question too, right? So,
but it is something that we deal with all the time. And so how do you balance it? Absolutely.
Nicola Springer with Kirksey Architects. Thank you, Nicola, very much for the future of schools. Thank you so much.
Bob.
All
Take care.
Next up, let's go to the future of play and bringing on Alex Whittington, who's a futurist with Tata Consultancy Services. Alex has been a buddy of mine for a long time, and thank you, Alex, very much for being here. And Alex, we've written together and you've worked at Children at Risk, so I'm excited to have you here. So tell us, Alex, about the future of play. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. So happy to be here. And I'm excited to join you on a topic that I'm actually really passionate about, and I imagine many people in the audience are too. It's the future of play. As a futurist and someone who studied the interaction of society and technology for a long time, it's clear to me that the future of work gets a lot of coverage, but the perspectives on the future of play are pretty few and far between. So today I want to walk you through a look at what's driving the future of play in terms of those trends and changes, and then kind of do some future scenarios to explore what it might all mean for the next generation. So let me just give you a little background. How do I do this? How does a futurist work? How do we achieve our goals? Well, we rely heavily on a skill that we call scanning. Scanning is how we start to know the future, and we begin to expand our thinking on that longer time horizon. Scanning gives you a sense of patterns that are influencing the future. And it's really one of the most universal futurist techniques. It helps us know and sense what's changing. And when you do it well, scanning has meaningful insights to think about the future. And by the way, I think anyone can learn to identify emerging ideas, not just us futurists. So what are we looking for when we're scanning? Well, some people call them signals. We're looking for firsts. We're looking for projections, models, forecasts. We're even looking at wildcards or black swans, things that might surprise us. We become intimately familiar with the fringes of society, and we do this by monitoring media every day. So I want to share with you some of that cutting edge information that I've encountered in my scanning, and I hope it helps you maximize your experience today, thinking more about the future of play and the future of childhood. So I'm going to share these insights, or you might say foresights, that'll help you think creatively about the next generation and what they might want from a gaming or a play experience. Let me go through each one. The first one is life extension and human enhancement. The modern human lifespan is increasing, right? There's a possibility of living up to 100 years or more. So how does this change how people will spend their time? Well, there's a very vibrant sense today that learning should be lifelong. So as we experience this social phenomena of older people with a better quality of life, having a larger role in society, we should expect that the way they spend their time could become more meaningful across the lifespan. So with more years of life, people might move jobs more often. They might need to learn new things more often too. And that's something that games or play can help. Gaming keeps the mind active, and games can be educational. And an extended lifespan also adds up to more variety in our lives. Don't forget that childhood, as we now know it, is a concept that's only been around for like 150, 200 years. Play might lose its connotation as a youthful pastime and become more universal across our lives. And along with the medical innovations that are ensuring a longer lifespan, there are cutting-edge technologies that can create an intellectually or physically enhanced person. And I think as a future-shaping signal, genetic engineering could affect how we play in the future. The next signal is biophilia. I'm going to make the argument that Gen Z and younger have a bad case of biophilia, bad in a good way. Biophilia is the love of nature, and young people today have a really obvious love of nature. Gardening is on the rise. Pets are extremely popular. We have something now called pet parents and fur babies. Houseplants are a big part of the aesthetic in design, as I'm sure Nicola can tell us. And by, over the next couple of decades, I think biophilia will be deeply rooted in society in a number of ways. One of the ways we might see this play out, well, let me give you an example. The Pacific garbage patch. This is this huge collection of plastic stuck in the ocean. It's the size of a continent. I think someone has actually named it. It's large enough to be named. And this is a big preoccupation of youth all around the world. Greta Thunberg and other activists have really brought attention to these issues. So I can imagine that some sort of gamification around solutions to climate change and environmental problems could become a really big thing between now and say 2040. Another driver is brain hacking. This is a techno-social shift that's very much on the horizon, but it seems we're on the path to merging mind and machine. The theory goes that a smart device, like a phone, a tablet, could supplement our brain power. It helps us remember things, keep track of stuff, and basically free up our cognitive abilities for other things. So we might have the ability to be smarter by virtue of an extended mind over the next couple of decades. As we witness the rise of brain hacking, technologies such as BCI, brain-computer interface, are emerging. Neurotech is a well-known one that Elon Musk has introduced. So it's something that in the 2020s could become pervasive in our homes, in our schools, in our workplaces. So we're going to see this reduction of friction between man and machine, transforming the brain into a user interface that we can interact with the outside world using artificial intelligence and possibly other digital tools. And since BCI, brain-computer interface, permits learning, students may eventually just hack their brains to academically achieve. rather than use tests or receive grades. We could hack our way into college, into a job or a promotion, and it might feel like we're playing. So that was a quick tour through 3 of the signals that's running through my head when I think about the future of play. But here in closing, let me do a thought experiment with you. There's a chance that another trend, the metaverse, will infuse play into more of the things that we do in the future. And there could be unforeseen benefits. So I want to ask, sort of entertain me on this thought experiment. What new types of play could the metaverse bring into our lives? Well, I'm going to talk about 3. The first one is called learning play. You know, many studies have found that a playful approach is very effective for kids to learn literacy, numeracy, social skills. Teaching through guided play has been more effective than traditional teaching at almost every subject, including math. So in the future, teachers might lead students to play to learn through open-ended questions or some sort of experience in the metaverse. And there's already a lot of research on why educational video games work for Gen Z and Gen Alpha. So the metaverse could revolutionize teaching and learning through a form of learning play. The second type is called working play. There's a company called GameFi, and they use this term play to earn. These are cryptocurrency games where the player actually earns digital currency, right? Bitcoin or some other form of digital currency as they play games. So in this GameFi community, some people are actually playing games to support their family, or they're gaming on scholarships. In other words, someone has sponsored or paid them to be a game player. It's a form of income. So it makes sense that in the future, the metaverse or some other gaming environment could be a way to earn money while you're playing. So the question is, will playing to earn ever become an alternative to actually having a job? The third type of play is mindful play. Until recently, play was understood to be the opposite of work. But adding play into an adult's daily routine has shown to literally improve job satisfaction and job performance. We also have these new kind of ambiguous concepts, bleisure, which is a word that mixes business and leisure, or you might have heard this other one, workcation. Those are becoming entrenched in the zeitgeist. A recent study found that 65% of people plan to extend a work trip into a leisure trip or vice versa last year. And the pandemic revealed that work and play are symbiotic. There could be metaverse spaces in the future that use play to help with work-life balance. And if we can improve emotional stability, personal growth, or productivity bursts, I think that makes the metaverse worth all of the hype. So do you remember when it was taboo to play computer games at work? The metaverse is changing that. But if the metaverse can be used for more meaningful matters, things like addressing stress, burnout, improving our mental health, improving learning outcomes, there could be a chain effect with many positive effects. An educational metaverse could make learning engaging and accessible, and it could help level the playing field. And lastly, I'll leave you with one final thought experiment question. Is it work if you're being paid to play? This could be a reality for Gen Alpha. Part of looking ahead to the future means exploring the opposite of what we assume will always be true. We've got to challenge our assumptions. So I want to thank you for your attention over the last few minutes. I hope you'll reach out to me on social media to share your thoughts and ideas. And I'm ready to move into the Q&A.
Alex, thank you so much. And I think that one of the things I love the most about your presentation is the idea of gamification of like world problems, right? I mean, how many of us know kids and young adults that spend a lot of time on games, and if they were solving world problems, that would be fantastic. So I think that's really wonderful. One of the things that I think for a lot of parents, when they hear your presentation and they hear about things like AI, they get a little scared of what play could be. And, you know, maybe 20 years ago, if people knew they could take a screen, an iPad into a restaurant and their kids could play a game in, you know, during the restaurant, they might have been sort of like, wow, I would never bring a TV into a restaurant. Yeah, we see it all the time now with kids. But what is, for you, what is scary about some of the things that might be a part of, especially play for children as we get into the future?
Great question. One of those other trends that's really important to look at is something called surveillance capitalism. This is this whole idea that Google and Facebook, they make tons of money off of collecting data about us. You know that saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So that is where I think we need to be very vigilant when it comes to kids, because they are feeding companies all of this information about themselves. And a lot of times we don't know where it ends up.
Yeah, and another question came through the Q&A about sort of this idea of kids spending a lot of time on TikTok or YouTube or Instagram. You know, I mean, I've talked to kids and they are learning stuff, but there's also a lot of time wasted on those things. How is that play? And is that something that you see changing also over time?
I think it will change, because I think the concept of what's play changes as the concept of work changes. I mean, we've been talking over the last several months with this chat GPT, it's changing work. Who's going to lose their job? Is the technology going to replace us? So the concept of work is changing. So with that, the concept of leisure and fun and downtime has to change too.
Alvin Toffler, who we've talked about before, you know, did this whole thing, a futurist, he did this whole thing about high tech, but also high touch. And so the more technology we have, the more need to sort of have high touch. Do you think there'll be sort of this focus on sort of more play dates and more using the playground? And I think you got to this whole idea of nature. You know, I'm often stunned, you know, when I go to Scandinavia, they have less time to be in good weather. So they really adore the great weather, right? They're like worshiping the sun practically. Do you see that, that as we have more high tech, you're going to have people who want to spend more time outside with others as well?
Absolutely. I think, you know, for every trend, there's a counter trend. So as our lives become more digital, more immersed in the metaverse, I think there is a strong hunger to be in nature, you know, to be out in the great outdoors and enjoy the living, you know, biologically living world. So for sure, I think that we will see, you know, people seeking strike the right balance, and it may be very subjective, but finding that correct level of what you might call, you know, phygital, the mix of the physical and the digital worlds, and making that a thread in your life. That may be something that people need to learn in school. You know, how do you strike that balance?
When you look at the future of play, Alex, and I know that you have 2 kids yourself, what do you wish that we had today that you probably see happening in the future that you think your kids or maybe you would have gotten a big kick out of in terms of playing?
Oh, well, you know, something that's kind of scary but really cool is, you know, being able to interact with historical time periods, or, you know, like recreate what it would be like to be around a dinosaur, you know, those sorts of experience, like to go into the metaverse and encounter a T-Rex or something. You know, I think that would be cool to be able to really immerse in historical times and places would be awesome. Also, but I think it would be a little scary. I think there's a little, you know, we talked about future shock, Alvin Toffler. What about history shock?
Yeah. I love the idea, right, of being virtual role playing in terms of being a part of history. I think that's pretty exciting. Alex Whittington, thank you very much for the work that you do. And thank you so much for being part of our summit on the future of children.
Thank you for having me, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Alex. All right. So next up, let's go to the future of equity on the screen. Sharon Jones, who is the Chief Equity Officer at Children at Risk. And also joining Sharon is Tracy J., who's the lead rebel at the Quiet Rebel. Tracy, thank you very much for being here. I'm so excited to hear about the future of equity, guys. And we're going to do 2 of these, one with Sharon and Tracy, where it's sort of lightning round, sort of tackling this. We're going to do one later on with Linda Corchado and myself, focusing on immigration. But I'm looking forward to this. Sharon and Tracy, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dr. Bob. And thanks, Tracy, for joining me. Tracy has been really active as a part of our PN3, Prenatal to 3 collaborative subcommittee on racial equity. And I'm interested to know, before we really get into our discussion, how your work with early childhood education professionals has informed some of your work in general when we're talking about kids in the future.
That is a big question. And also, thanks for having me here. It's very interesting to be in the room with people who are actively working on the best interest of children who just got here.
Yeah.
Right? We spend a lot of time and energy thinking about older children and about adults. But I think very rarely do we spend enough energy working on the people who are just coming into the world, and how do we offer them the best place to live possible. And so I have been taking those children with me into other rooms.
Yeah. Great. So as we talk about the future of kids, and we're talking a lot about technology today, we have to acknowledge the digital divide and the fact that in Texas, 2 million households don't have high-speed internet. And that's urban and rural areas, but especially the rural areas. And in Texas, Laredo and Brownsville account for the top 2 worst connected cities. So what this means for children and families as it relates to equity is that Black and Brown families are suffering the most. And they have, through this digital divide, a lack of access to things like telemedicine, digital learning tools. Minority-owned small businesses are stifled when they are in areas where there's limited access to high-speed internet. And we're finding that it's a necessity and not a luxury. What are your thoughts about the future of equity as it relates to getting people access to these digital tools that can change their lives?
Well, we just heard in some previous conversations, right, that a few years ago, we wouldn't have even imagined taking, as Dr. Bob said, a TV into a restaurant, right? Having access to technology at every turn. And because we know that that is the way of the world, having technology at every turn, if you in fact don't have access to technology at all, then that creates a chasm that is hard for people to cross, right? There's assumptions made in the way we interact that people will have access to technology. You can't park your car without access to technology, right? You almost can't order a meal without access to technology, right? All of these things that we just sort of take for granted that are floating around the back of our minds, as we move towards more digital ways of participating in the world, all of those things will require access. And so we have to close that divide in order to make sure that those spaces stay equitable.
Yeah, that really crossed my mind recently when I made a purchase for food somewhere, and it said we are a cashless restaurant. And so for some reason, I didn't have cash or credit card with me, but I did have a phone. And so with my phone, I was able to, use my bank account to purchase food. And it made me think about how we take for granted those options in this digital world, and how, many families and communities are left behind when they don't have those options to just make simple transactions that we take for granted.
Yeah, I think about it when I have to park someplace, and the parking meters don't take money.
Right. Yeah. So it's everywhere. So in the 70s, there was a song that said that the future, or that the revolution would not be televised. And we're finding that that's not true. We're finding that when things happen in the public eye, immediately it's everywhere. And so when you think it's everywhere on our phones, Twitter and TikTok. So when you think about the future of equity and the future of communities that demand equity, and our Gen Z babies and our millennial adults, how do you think that this digital era will affect the future of equity and how we communicate, relate, and learn from each other?
So I have 3 humans that I gave birth to. 2 of them are millennials technically, and 1 of them is Gen Z. And it's interesting for me to watch how they interact with the world, and how they sort of straddle the line between the things that I value and the things that they desire, right? They are very much a generation of believing that they are entitled to whatever they desire. And so, and because they believe that they are entitled to whatever they desire, they go after it. and they force the rest of us to come with them.
I do love that, and even though it is disturbing at times about my own children, I do love that they are inheriting a world in which they understand that they have just as much right to a bright future as anyone, and they demand it. And I love that, even though it can make for intense discussions in our home.
Yeah, and part of that is because of is in large part due to technology, right? So we had, I can't speak for you, I had the card catalog, right, and the Encyclopedia Britannica. So yes. that was how I got my information, right? But the children, beginning mostly with the millennial age, but mostly Gen Z, had immediate access to the whole world, right? Mm-hmm. So you could see things that were not just happening in your neighborhood or in your city. You know what world problems are affecting where you live, and also the things that are not where you live. And so having that access also creates new desires, right? Sure. If when you're growing up, all you ever get to see is the people on your street, then you don't even necessarily know that you can dream for more. But we have children now who know that they can dream for more because they can see more every day.
Yeah, I think also this access to information through the digital era also lends itself to a problem of access to disinformation. And so what are you seeing in your work as it relates to technology in terms of what we have to combat?
Oh, welcome to Texas. I'm tickled, but not really in a good way, at how often we point fingers at Florida, which that has its own sets of issues. But we live in Texas, that is kissing cousins to Florida, and where people are actively trying to stifle information, but also provide false information. And the more people don't have access to true information, and at the same time are receiving false information, it's so problematic. I don't even have words for it in this moment.
Yeah, I think that's a big reason why Children at Risk has a focus on equity at this point in time, because there's so much disinformation. And so, through the use of technology and use of virtual summits, we're able to get true data to people that need it the most as we do this work. The last thing I think we can get into pretty quickly is a discussion on some of the wins that we had during the legislative session and where we still need to go in terms of the future of equity. In spite of the troubles that we've had with DEI being removed from certain institutions of higher learning and government, we had some wins with the Crown Act passing. We had some wins with the expansion of Medicaid to mothers 12 months after birth. What do you think are some issues as it relates to this future of equity that we still need some work done in?
I think that the problems that we face in Texas are problems that we face nationally, and that is owning the truth of our country, sitting in it, and moving forward from the truth, right? We've been moving forward from the lie for a long time, but if we could start moving forward from the truth, I think that would give us, it would give us an advantage. We expect and call for truth in all other areas of our life. In our interpersonal relationships, we don't like people to lie to us, right? In our business dealings, we don't like people to lie to us. And so if we are going to have a country that is prosperous, then we have to take those same attitudes into the way we govern ourselves.
Well, what gives you hope about the future of equity in Texas? Are there any best practices or practitioners in this work that you'd like to uplift?
What gives me hope is the fact that even though legislators in general are attacking this system, the belief system of diversity, equity, inclusion, the people still show up, right? The people really want to do things differently. And I would be remiss, because my brain just isn't finding names right now, if I started naming folks, so I don't want to leave anybody out. But I will shout out the PN3 collaborative and the organizations that are attached to it, because I get to work with that group on a regular basis and I see that commitment. So
that's great. Dr. Bob, you have questions for Tracy or me?
Are you kidding me? So, of course, Tracy, I wanted to ask you, we see the demographics in Texas changing faster than a lot of people would want them to change, right? But they're changing. It's the reality. 70% of our children in the state of Texas are children of color. 65% of our children are coming from low-income families. There's going to be a time, we assume, that those kids are going to be voting age. And there's going to be a time when they've seen everything happening that they're going to want to vote. And what is going to happen to equity in Texas when those kids vote? And here they, in a sense, right, you can make a pretty good case that there's a lot of oppression going on to those kids right now, right? So what's going to happen when they vote, and how will that change equity in Texas, Tracy?
Well, what could happen when they vote is that the pendulum swings the other direction. What I think is the hope of current legislators is that they can poison the water enough that those children, when they are voting age, still vote in the same direction that has kept the state where it is. And so if we continue to remove truth from classrooms, and we continue to spoon feed children just the parts of history we want them to know, and we continue in the model of us versus them, right? Then what we're going to do is recreate much of what we already have. But my hope is that parents will help children remember all the things they're facing in this moment, and so that they carry those things with them into their voting age.
I think a lot of us assume, right, that you're going to see kids voting for change, young people voting for change. And I do remind people, all those hippies in the 60s that were against the war ended up voting for Reagan, right? I mean, it's so you always have to put this pressure on. But let's assume that 70% decides, no, listen, I'm tired of it and I want change and equity. What does our state look like then? Because I could only imagine that in a state that if Texas becomes a blue state, I can imagine that that's going to be the calling card for people to say, we have to get rid of the Electoral College. I mean, that'll be the first thing that Republicans will be demanding, right? So, but what else will be changing, do you think, if that 70% vote, sort of in regard to how they've been treated during their childhood?
Yeah, in a more progressive way. I think that if they vote in that way, one of the things is that's going to make Texas way more popular, which Houston is already full, folks. Please don't move here. But also, I think that we'll see more accountability in government, which is a thing that I don't think we see enough of now. Right? We say we want change. We say we don't like what's happening, and yet we keep voting in the same way. Right. And so we're being really passive citizens. We're being really passive voters. And we're trusting that, surely the worst case scenario won't happen, because humans just can't be that way. But humans can be that way. Humans have been that way. And we see evidence of it all the time. And the more and more things that are taken away from people, you would think in a system where we tout freedom, that people would want to fight to get those freedoms back. But I'm hopeful. I'm going to be hopeful with you, Dr. Bob.
Yeah. The future is an amazing thing, right? We could look into it and it could change in a minute. And I often tell people, you would have thought that the changing moment around equity was when we elected a Black president, but indeed it was when the revolution was televised, wasn't it, Sharon? I mean, that's when we started to see when people use their cell phone to show the brutality that could be happening on our streets, right? That's when things change. So you never know what's going to be that catalyst that changes things. Sharon Jones, Tracy J., thank you very much for bringing us a look at the future of equity. So exciting. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.
All right, now we're going to take a step in the next direction and look at the future of youth activism. And Addie Lenzer is with us. She's with Our Turn, as is Arsha Papari, who's also with Our Turn. Addie is a student at Middlebury College in Vermont. Arsha is a student at UT Austin here in Texas. And so I want to hear from both of you guys as you give us a snapshot and look at the future of youth activism. Take it away, Addie.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Arshia, I'll pass it to you to start.
Yes, thank you. Greetings, friends, colleagues, and special guests. It's my honor to welcome you all today to join the discussion with open hearts and open minds as we begin. In reflecting on the future of, we would be remiss if we did not reflect on the strong legacy of youth organizers who directly shaped the tapestry of our nation's complex history. Before we dive into it, I'll pass the mic to my colleague to kick off our discussion with a round of introductions.
Awesome, thank you. So we are students from Our Turn. Our Turn is a national education nonprofit whose mission is to amplify and elevate the voices of young people in the fight for education justice. So we see a world that has huge disparities in discipline and opportunity gaps and resource inequities in schools that are restricting teaching the truth. And to address these problems, we really work to harness the power of young people. Students are in classrooms every day. They are the ones who are closest to these problems, and they are uniquely positioned to lead and identify policy changes. So on the screen, those are some pictures of Our Turn fellows. And yeah, we will drop a link to our student agenda in the chat so you can learn a little bit more about some of our priorities. Awesome, thanks, Arshia. And here are some other pictures about Our Turn as well. So now we're going to do some individual introductions. So my name is Addie. I'm an activist based in Vermont, but I'm currently living in Southern California. My activism around education specifically started when I was like 14. I was really upset that I wasn't learning the truth about race in school. I felt that the history that I was learning was really whitewashed and non-inclusive. And I actually took a Black history class outside of school, and I realized, like, wow, I wasn't learning any of this in school, in my American history classes. And this just made me really upset because how are we supposed to have a multiracial and inclusive democracy if we don't learn the full history? So I wrote letters to all the superintendents in the state in Vermont, asking them to take action. And then I founded the Vermont Student Anti-Racism Network, which is the logo on the screen. So we create curriculum and write bills and do legislative advocacy and donate books and a lot of things like that. So that's where my activism started. And then I got a job with Our Turn and began advocating as my job, which is really cool. So just to close out my introduction, I wanted to bring up a quote by Malcolm X, that education is the passport to the future. And really the future of education is intrinsically tied to the future of youth activism. So we wanted to kind of preface our discussion with the fact that education is super tied to the future of youth. And to make change, we have to start with education. So I will pass it to you, Arshia.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Addie, and what a wonderful introduction. Following up, I'm Ashra Pakpe, and I'm a young youth activist and fellow with Our Turn from Austin, Texas. I began my journey in youth activism last summer as a student leader with Our Turn and working on state-level policy development and advocacy at the Texas State Board of Education, along with a peer group of 11 other student leaders. We were drawn to take action in state-level educational policy because it's an area which has direct and significant impact on students' lives and development, though it is nearly barren of any youth and student involvement. As we fought for truthful and complete social studies curriculum, we saw the lack of opportunity and of care for student voice in the politics and policies which affect us most of all. As the systems of political action and the majority of voices of authority within those systems refuse to take meaningful action or to heed the calls of the youths who were able to access these spaces in the first place. However, as we experienced these issues, we also saw the desire and passion of youth to engage with policies and politics to engender a future built for and by them. Though having been unsuccessful in advocating for literature and social studies curricula in the Texas SBOE, our initial action in the state level advocacy was a catalyst for my later political engagement, as I authored a legislative bill on the issue of truthful and complete social studies education in Texas schools, which I attempted to progress in the Texas legislature with the assistance of my colleagues this legislative session. Now, as we begin this presentation, I would like to invite you all to join me in taking a trip through the history of youth activism, overviewing key moments in the path to development of youth activism of today and tomorrow. As we delve into the legacy of youth activism, please transition to the next slide, thank you, or to the next couple of slides. Awesome, right there. As we delve into the legacy of youth activism, we'll first look into the Revolutionary War, which was an integral time in American history. Though an often unheard side of it is how youth played a role in the development of the foundations of the United States. For example, 16-year-olds William Diamond, Elizabeth Zane, and Sybil Ludington took action as drummers and messengers, aiding the revolutionary cause. On to the next slide, advancing into the next century, the abolitionist movement did not see young people forgotten either. The image on screen is of a children's primer, which argues for abolishing slavery. Additionally, in the mid-1800s, another teenager, Anna Elizabeth Dickinson, began writing essays and giving speeches on the then unpopular topics of women's rights and the abolition of slavery. And as we move forward to industrialization on the next slide, and the dawn of a new century came about, youth continued taking action to better their circumstances through various means, such as the women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, and the initial civil rights actions through the early 1900s. Specifically in the early 1920s and 30s, HBCU students in the South launched protests to protect quality education on their campuses, and other youth from those universities took action to end Jim Crow laws. On to the next slide, and as we advance to the mid-20th century, we saw a beginning of anti-McCarthy protests as well as anti-nuclear weapons protests on college campuses throughout the 1950s. This was the development of the Young Left. Youth activism really began to ramp up and accelerate in this era of American history and in great prominence during the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam War, when youth at colleges across the country stood up in protest of political and societal issues. In the 1960s and 70s, the Civil Rights Movement captivated the hearts and minds of the American public. Many youth, some even elementary schoolers, took the streets and marched in protest of the societal and racial disparities of the latter 20th century, and many faced the force of unjust political and judicial action to stem their rise. This era was a pivotal point in the strife for justice and brought the impact and significance of youth activism to the forefront of societal understanding. As youth continued taking political action to better their communities and society overall, they faced extensive, continual political, social, and societal pushback, and yet powered through to change the outcomes of history. The work of youth activists throughout these movements and moments in time have had a profound impact on the moral, political, and societal consciousness of our country and have brought us to where we are today. Now I'd like to pass it off to my colleague for our next few slides.
Thank you. Thank you for giving that overview of the history. It's really empowering to hear about past youth activists. So now we kind of want to transition to the present and the 21st century. So there are many youth activists today who are engaged in the same fight as others before them. An example is Nupol Kiazolo, who is 18 years old. She's the president of the Youth Coalition for Black Lives Matter of New York and the founder and CEO of Vote 2000. She held her first protest at age 13 when she wore a hoodie to school and protested in honor of Trayvon Martin. Another example is Desmond Naples, who is an LGBTQ+ rights activist and drag performer. They launched the House of Amazing, a safe space for children who do drag, and they also launched an educational tool to help youth learn about pride. So obviously there are so many other examples of current youth activists, but those are just two that we're highlighting. And I'm going to pass it back to Arshia to talk about like why activists are doing what they are.
Thank you, Addie. That was an awesome overview as well. And now having summarily covered the legacy of youth activism, and can we go to the next slide as well, in the United States, from the very beginning to our current condition, let us now look at the why behind the who and the what of our current era of action, as youth activists take their understandings and ambitions to form the political and societal forces of change rising in our chapter and the next of youth activism. So why are youth still organizing? While the United States has changed extensively since its inception, we still have our work cut out for us before we achieve a society that fully upholds the promise of justice and equality for all. In 2023, Black people are 3 times more likely than white people to be pulled over by police, and Black students are more likely to be disciplined via detention, suspension, and other forms than white students. Since 1981, the rate of Earth's warming has been more than twice as fast as the past, and if we don't change course on our climate footprint soon, Earth will be unsavable. There have already been over 260 mass shootings this year. Mass shooting drills have also made their way into countless classrooms. In 1 year, there have been over 2,000 book bans, many of the books targeting the stories of marginalized and minority communities. And this list can extensively go on. Young people in generations before us led the way, shaping and pushing the moral trajectory of our country. From the words of civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer, "No one is free until we are all free." The leaders and political healers of tomorrow are here today, and we are ready to demand and fight for meaningful change for our communities. We stand with environmental justice and human rights leaders like Greta Thunberg and Malala Yousafzai. Youth activists can be in our own neighborhoods, testifying at school board meetings, volunteering at food banks, registering people to vote, and so much more. To solve the world's most pressing issues, we need young people to continue to take the reins. We can't wait any longer. Youth from throughout history have stood up to the challenge, and now it's our turn.
So, to close it out, we have talked a lot about the past. We want to bring it to the future. So, what does the future of youth activism look like? I want to invite you all to imagine being in a room with other young people who are also passionate about education justice. You see hundreds of students coming together, and you feel empowered because we're all discussing justice in our schools. But this is not just a dream. Last summer, my organization, the Vermont Student Anti-Racism Network, had over 300 students attend our statewide summit. 300 students came together who were all passionate about anti-racism. This is the future of activism. We all have different stories about how we got involved in this work, but we all have a similar vision, that is justice and dignity for all students. And I can guarantee that youth are ready and poised to make change. But we need you all to be there with us to do the work. Youth activists can't just come from young people working in silos. We need to work with youth and adults partnering together. We need you all to show up and do the hard work with us, revisioning what the world can look like. Because like I said before, Gen Z is poised and ready to make change, but the future of activism needs all of us. So we wanted to just leave with a call to action. Are you with us? And Arshia, I'll pass it to you to just do our last closing.
Thank you, Addie. And that was a very powerful segment there. As we come to a close of our presentation today, we would like to thank you all for listening and joining in today's discussion. In true organizing spirit, we have a few asks and a call to action for you all today. True systems change cannot and will not happen without intergenerational and multifaceted organizing and activism. That's why we're calling on you as adults, developing the actions and structures of our time to authentically collaborate with youth in the movement alongside us. Work with us, not for us.
Great. Thank you guys very, very much. Addie and Asha, I'd like just a quick question for each of you. It's so great to hear young people, and the reality is there are a lot of young people, right, like yourselves, that are very engaged in many different issues. Addie, for you, when you think about the future and your impact as a youth activist, what is the issue that you feel like, I really do think we could have some meaningful change here, or the issue that you're maybe most hopeful about active change?
Yeah, I feel a lot of hope around education. And I'm not just saying that because we're at an education conference. I feel like there's a lot of mobilization around education. I think people are really realizing that there are a lot of issues in the education system, from like not having diverse, inclusive curriculum to not having individualized education where students can kind of have it tailored to their own interests. So there are a lot of really significant problems with education. And I really have started to see people mobilizing around that. And I think that in the next few years, it's really a make or break time in terms of making change. And I think if we're able to make change around education, I think that's where we can make something happen.
And that ties into that Malcolm X quote of yours as well.
Yes.
Adsha, for you, what's the big issue that you think, I think there's going to be some good change here if we keep the pressure up?
I think the big issue for me is also education, because I guess in politics, a lot of people can say a lot of things are the basis of society, but I personally believe that education is the basis of society and its development in particular, whether that be politically or economically. So with that, I would say having a illegitimate, untruthful, censored, non-functioning education system, and aside from even those ideological and intellectual aspects, having an education system that's not practically functional either, just at the bare roots of it, is great cause for our political atmosphere to come together and push for development and progression, to unsurface and unveil all of these different issues that have been piling up over the decades through our education system and in our schools around the country, and not just in Texas. But if we keep the pressure on these issues, if we keep the pressure on the intellectual aspect and the lack of such, as well as the bare broken bones of the education system, I'm sure that we can bring change. If not, it's quite possible that those in power would not be so anymore if they continue to ignore the real issues at hand in education.
Yeah, Arsha Papari, Addie Lensner, thank you guys very much. Thank you for our turn for the work that you guys are doing. I look forward to being a part of your world. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next subject. We're going to go into the future of nature-based learning. Audrey Rowland is with us, and she's the founder and chief executive officer of Green Space Learning. And so, Audrey, a couple of years ago, I was in Sweden, and someone said, "Oh, Bob, we really need to let you tour this school." And it was a school where everything was taught outside. The whole class was outside, the teachers were outside, everything was outside. And the first thought, when I've told people in Texas that, they've said, "Oh, it's too hot here," and the reaction is, it gets really cold in Sweden, yet they still do it all year round outside. And so I love this idea, right, that kids can sort of fit in anywhere. And I love the idea of this sort of integrating with the green space. So I'll let you take it away from there. But thanks for being here, Audrey.
Great. I'm going to turn off my video, and I'm so sorry to do that, but it's because my just a little bit. Are y'all with me?
We're here.
Okay. So we've had so much good information this morning already. Some of it can be a little overwhelming when we think about how do we bulletproof our schools, and how do we keep play in the hands of children, and and how do we keep the power where the power needs to be, which is in the hands of our youth. And I think there's a really great and easy way we can do that right now. And that is to bring children outside, to get this idea of connecting with their world in a more meaningful way, and to trust children to begin and own their own educational journey, and then letting that continue into this advocacy that we want to see in our youth and these changes we want to see in future generations. So when we think about the history of school, why school exists, why it's structured the way it is, it really is intended to be a holding space for children until they're legally allowed to work, right? So we created compulsory schooling to combat child labor. And so really the way that schools were designed, the way education was created, these were all things that provided the kind of training that workers needed for that next stage, right? So this kind of sitting in rows, this following instructions, this walking in lines, this clocking in and out, this perfect attendance, all of these things really come from a place of worker preparation, not really leadership preparation. And so we know the workforce is changing, as we've talked about already this morning. We know that we have a very different idea of what the workplace should look like and what children need. And we want to start preparing children for an environment that's not about knowing stuff, and it's not about being able to recite memorized information or being able to fall in line, but that's really more about being able to be a problem solver and to be independent and autonomous and to be able to be self-motivated and self-managed, to be able to communicate and connect with others and with nature in a way that makes them responsible and good stewards of the world. So when we get outside, we increase all learning, as has already been mentioned by a couple of other speakers, that outdoors is really where it's at. And we need to connect them with what the outdoors really is, instead of thinking about playgrounds and parks and play spaces as being denaturalized, right, with turf and pour and play and built structures, but instead as an opportunity for them to really connect with the world and to play in a way that gives them their own sense of risk and innovation. When we build big pole and platform type items, then we are saying, this is what we believe your play space should look like, right? So this is the risks you should be taking. These are the rules you should be following. So a play space that's 5 feet off the ground really says to a child, stay within the rails. It kind of mimics real risk and real risk taking by making them, putting them up high, when really they would create those risks themselves, as you can see in this video, just from cartwheeling and jumping off of low things and interacting with real tools and having some space and independence from adults and adult direction and redirection and instruction to solve their own problems. Just as you see these kids are working through this social emotional issue right now, solve their own problems without adult interaction. And what this does is prepare a workforce that is innovative and interested and curious, that's problem solvers, that's in touch with both themselves, their own bodies, and the earth, that knows how to communicate and work with others and problem solve their way out of conflict, and releases them from this passive, learned kind of helplessness of, I'll just wait to be told what to do, or nobody explained it to me. And so that they can have these, kind of this like managed mentality, when what we want to really institute in them is this leadership mentality. And so Green Space does a lot of work with childcare centers and elementary schools and municipalities to bring a simpler, more nature-inspired play space to children. You saw two different spaces in this video, and that's deliberate. One to show kind of this like show-stopping playground in Houston that just has like all of the nature bells and whistles. And then this one, which is a little bit more of a small center, a bit more kind of rustic, but the children's interactions are the same. They're enjoying this kind of independent play and being able to develop their own risks and be successful and also be allowed to fail. So, and to work through that. So what we're seeing on these playgrounds is more empathy, more compassion, more creativity, more problem solving and innovation. But more than anything, what we see are children willing to take risks and then building the resiliency that they're going to need for this world ahead, right? Life is hard. And I don't see it getting any easier. And we need children to learn when they're young that mistakes are not forever, that, you know, having a failure does not define who you are, and that a skinned knee is just a minor and short-term inconvenience. And nature is the best teacher of resilience. It's ever changing, it's challenging, it's patient. It allows children to really kind of make their own way and then learn their own limitations so that they can keep themselves safe in this world, and so that they can keep picking themselves up over and over again and finding that forward path. So what we believe here at Green Space is that if we can keep children outside doing all the things, they can do everything outside they can do inside, then we're going to see a healthier community. And this kind of ties into the environment as well. When we think about we're building green spaces, which means we are supporting the environment and bringing in more nature. You can see it as an economic investment because we're thinking about the future workforce, but most importantly, it's an investment in humanity. It's bringing us back to who we are and what we need to be successful in this coming world. I can take some questions.
Yeah, Audrey, let me ask, you know, we heard this from Nicola when she talked about architecture, right? The need that green is good for learning. And we heard this from Alex when she talked about the future of play, about how young people are much more enamored with nature, maybe than the generation before them. But I don't see a big movement in school districts or at the state level to say more green, you know, let's do more outdoor learning. How do we change that? Or is this something that's going to happen a little bit more organically?
Well, I think COVID took us a little ways down that road by, you know, making outside cool again, by it being the safest place to be as far as germs. But then you look at kind of looking at the safety of schools as well, and being outside is not the safest place to be. And so it really comes down to a design decision and to a weighed risk of where do we want our children to learn? How do we want them to engage? And I do see in Austin and other school districts where they are sending kids outside for lunch, where they're developing outdoor classrooms, you know, using the field trip kind of option to get children in touch with nature. So, and then as our younger children come into our elementary schools, which seems to be a trend that we're getting younger and younger age groups going into the elementary schools, we need to consider that their needs are going to be different than those of a fourth, fifth, sixth grader.
One other issue, and this was brought up when we talked about the future of equity, is that when we look at a lot of outdoor schools, and having worked in universities a lot of my life, I noticed that sometimes at some major universities, outdoor programs and adventure programs were overwhelmingly white. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until, you know, but I also visited schools. I was the dean of a college up in New England, where there was this extensive effort to say, no, we're going to, you know, do some hand holding here. And this is not going to be a white program. It's almost like in Texas, we're going to need to do more of that. If 70% of our kids are children of color, what are we going to do differently to sort of introduce students to this idea of outdoor schooling and outdoor adventure and green space?
But we're going to have to take it to them rather than asking them to come find us. And Green Space has a nonprofit it partners with called Out to Play, where we do take kind of a mobile classroom that has all these nature elements in it to places like the WIC office or the food bank or the Social Security office, where parents are receiving services and children are kind of just waiting. And how can we get this little time here, or just into neighborhoods and apartment complexes, and really think about how can we take it to them, to their neighborhoods, to help them experience it, know that it's safe. And then once they, have more information about it, then perhaps they will be able to advocate it for their own neighborhoods or to be able to find those services. But I think the important thing is that we have to be diligent about taking it where they are, where families are that aren't getting green experiences.
It's interesting, right? Because one introduction to outdoor education is just having much more accessible and fun and interesting playgrounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And parks near our homes. Yet in a lot of cities and a lot of parts of cities in Texas, we don't have that naturally. And that probably has to be part of this movement, doesn't it? In terms of making sure we have accessible green space to all of our children.
And thinking about how do we accommodate the weather we have, right? So thinking about planting trees and creating shade. And there was an interesting study I just read or heard about yesterday about children playing in the heat in Texas, and how at 91 degrees, children naturally seek out shade and lower energy activities. They are good at keeping themselves safe if they're given the experiences to do so. So we want to have outdoor environments that support all types of play and activity, not just big run body play, but also just how can you be outside and be safe and comfortable.
And you know what, to your earlier point, during the pandemic, I certainly found the shadiest, breeziest place to have friends over for happy hour during the pandemic, right?
Right.
And who would have imagined that I could have an outdoor happy hour in July in Houston, right? But I think we managed, right? We figured these things out because we had the will to do these things. And I think that's what needs to happen with this, is that we know that outdoor education and education within outdoor spaces is a really good idea for our kids, but we're going to have the will to do this sort of thing.
Well, when you look at it from an environment and an economic and just what's good for humans standpoint, there's really no reason not to, it's kind of a no-brainer.
Is there a state, Audrey, where you see much more education in the outdoors happening that you could point to as like, this is what the future should look like around green space?
Well, I think the Northwest does a pretty good job with forest schools and kind of extreme versions of outdoor learning, although it is predominantly a privilege for few rather than the standard for many. But states with better environment, with better weather, do tend to just do more outside in general. So I think it's only really here in the South that we have gotten this feeling like it's not an option for us.
Yeah, very good. Audrey Rowland with Green Space, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thanks for being part of the summit today. All right, so next up, we want to go into the future of immigration. And Linda Cortado is with us. She's the director of the Children's Immigration Network at Children at Risk. She's out in El Paso, Texas. And I'm joining her for this little thing because we both love immigration and talking about immigration, Linda. So the first thing I want to bring up is, Linda, when we look at Texas today, and many times we'll say that Texas is the future face of America, what's going on here. And so I want to sort of lay out the groundwork for what's in Texas. Politically in Texas, the majority of our state is Republicans. And when you ask just Republicans, what's the most important issue for them, they will say immigration, not pro-immigration, sort of anti-immigration, and border security. Clearly very important for the majority of our state. Rightly or wrongly, that is their issue. But when we look at the demographics, a third of our children in the state of Texas are immigrants or children of immigrants. 70%, as I mentioned earlier, are children of color. When we look at suburban counties, and I'll look at Fort Bend, which is right outside of Houston, the county with the least child poverty in our state. And it's as diverse as they come, 25% Asian, 25% African-American, 25% Latino, 25% white. And new immigrants play a big part of the future of our state, right? We are the youngest state, and we have a very good economy. A lot of it is because of immigration. So how do we see the future? That was a long intro, Linda, but how do we sort of see the future of Texas as the face of our nation around immigration when we have these two push and pulls going on?
Right. Well, I think a lot of it is how do we climb out of these trenches of culture wars, right? That's something that we're just coming out of now with the state legislature. Wars on the LGBT plus community, war against the border, war against immigrants, just like you said. Yet the reality that we're not grounded in is that 60% of the Texas population is non-white. So I think a lot of people think when you think of Texas, the politics it's 100%, at least 90% conservative, but so many are not engaged in the system. So, when I think about immigrant children, like myself, I'm a US citizen, my parents both naturalized. It's easy for immigrant kids to feel left out of the system. Imagine being a 9-year-old US citizen whose father was just deported. How do you feel that your best interests are being listened to, right? So I think a lot of that is how do we finally center ourselves in the reality? You think about 9/11, which really sealed the border. That was a war on terrorism that ended my transnational life as I knew it on the border. But I also think about post-World War II and that Reconstruction era that brought on the Bracero program that my father was a part of, where the US was inviting Mexican workers to come to our economy and strengthen our economy. So it's like these huge pillars of our history that make or break how our policies will be molded to support immigrant communities. But we really need to do that now in Texas. When we can look like the rest of the country needs to learn from us, and we really need to lead on these key issues like education.
When I do a press conference, and when you do a press conference, Linda, no matter what the issue is, if it's around children and families, we know that Univision and Telemundo are going to show up, right? And news media tends to react to what their viewership wants. And so for me, that tells me that the Latino, the Spanish-speaking community that watches Univision and Telemundo, they really care about children and family issues, right? They're going to show up. It will lead the news. And the stuff that we're covering is covered by that. So when I think about a future Texas that has if today 54% of the kids are Latino, that's going to grow into a majority of Latinos as a major voting bloc. And today, as we speak, the Latino voting bloc is not powerful, even though they're a majority, they're not powerful. But that could change. What will a Latino voting bloc mean to the future of Texas and to the future, if we're the face of America?
Well, I think, the first step is, are we going to create the voting bloc? That's something that a lot of people keep looking at. It's the silent giant in Texas, yet we're not mobilizing, we're not voting. And so, that goes back to the predicament that I feel all immigrants experience in this country. If you feel shut out by the system and disregarded, are we going to continue this path of not voting, of not registering to vote, or are we going to mobilize and see that the opportunity is now? So I think one is we need to find our agency again. This is something I've been saying in other panels of, in our equity panel about being passive as a citizen. We really need to become capital C citizens, to be involved again in our communities, and change the face of the ledge to make sure that it represents all of us, that we can get out of the culture wars and really do the work of investing in our economy and our education. So I think that's a big step that we're working at the Children's Immigration Network as well, is finding our agency in these opportunities, in these spaces of opportunities that really work to see how can we rebuild. We don't need to give all this power to others. We have our power as citizens and residents in Texas to rebuild.
I want to stick with this for a little bit, because I wonder and I hope, and this would be my projection in the future, is that a lot of times when you travel abroad, even when you travel on a foreign airline, you realize that people pay much more attention to children than maybe we do as Americans. And I even think about my colleagues who are child activists in other states, and they will say, oh, we're a blue state, but it's no easier to pass pro-child legislation in a blue state because kids don't vote. But I wonder if we're talking about this world where immigration has made an impact on Texas, where we indeed have more first-generation immigrants in our state, does that make a difference in terms of pro-child legislation and pro-family legislation? Because we sometimes talk a good game about being pro-child and pro-family, but indeed the reflection isn't there.
I hope so. And that is a huge motivator that keeps migrants focused on their end game. Their end game is to improve the bottom line for their families. That's why they made such significant sacrifices. So in many ways, we see this engagement like you're talking about in the media, because parents want to be more informed. They want to support their children. They see the barriers they're facing. They are 100% in this country to remove those barriers and make sure they succeed. So I think in many ways, immigrant families are very much in line with our goals to improve children's lives. So we need to hear their voices. I want them to be more active, and a big place is schools. Schools are the first formal American institution that immigrant families are introduced to. So long as these places continue to be safe spaces, this can be the site for activism and its civic engagement.
What's going to be, or what could be a big catalyst around immigration in the future? I mean, when we think about what's happening with immigration now, what are some of the things that could change the way the country as a whole thinks about immigration? And I'm thinking in a positive way. What could be that catalyst that changes things in a positive way? And I go back to, I don't know, but 100 years ago, there was a whole political party based upon being anti-immigrant, and they were affectionately known as the Know Nothing Party, right? They knew nothing, and I wonder, when we look at the data, it's pretty clear that immigration is good for our country. So, what will be the catalyst that changes things around immigration, do you think?
Right. Well, Texas is bucking the trend because we're a very young state. But others are not. So when you look at the needs of an aging population, I think their desire to bring in more workers to support our senior citizens is really important. And that's where a lot of innovation is needed. But I think also understanding the transnational character of migrants. Many migrants just want to come and work and be with their families. So that transnational character is something that I'm starting to see someone with the Biden administration with their parole programs as well. But the fluidity, that's something we understand on the border. But more importantly, our desire to strengthen our workforce and knowing that we can't do it alone in America, and that there are many immigrants that have the same values as we do who are willing to answer to that call and fix those needs. Yeah.
It's interesting that there are still so many red states that still capitalize on immigrant workers. And I think about Iowa, which, and people often don't think of Iowa as a state that has a lot of immigrants, but in the meat cutting industry, the meat packing industry, immigrants are a big part of the success of that industry. And that's happening in Iowa. It's almost like we tend not to pay attention to what's really helping us in our country.
Great point. I mean, you saw raids, for example. There were a lot of workforce raids under the Trump administration that really devastated these economies that were these economies, but also cities that were very conservative, anti-immigration. But when they see that when we actually enforce the laws to that level and deport, we hurt our bottom line. So I think that's also an important thing to know, as well as the migration patterns themselves. We're seeing in Florida, there's these laws now that domestically within that state that are closing themselves off to migrants. And so now other migrants are thinking creatively about where else they'll go. So those sorts of workforce searches amongst migrants and landing in other areas that may not be a traditional landing place is good for those economies too. You know, here in El Paso, we've had governments from the North and South Carolina come to us and say, hey, I hear you've got a lot of migrants coming in. How can we bring that workforce to our states? Because they certainly need it. So, you know, there's those glimpses of hope that I see when we're looking at our economies, that I think, can we really get to the bottom of it and make that meaningful change for all immigrant families, to improve the bottom line for our economy, but also to improve our families, make sure our families stay together and that our kids are supported.
You and I were at the Sacred Heart Church in El Paso a week or so ago, talking to some of the migrants who'd come across the border seeking asylum and that were just waiting on their hearing. And there was one woman who talked about, the last thing I want to do is go to Florida. They are so anti-immigrant there. And it goes back to Tracy's, you know, we're very similar to Florida, but somehow Florida is getting the bad rap, and I'm okay with that. And so immigrants don't want to go to Florida. And we hear from Florida that they're having trouble with farm workers because they have this anti-immigrant status. Farm workers don't want to go to Florida. But I think about farm workers. I think about the national shortage in nursing, which we could alleviate by allowing nurses from other countries to come. You and I have talked about the shortage of teachers who will teach Spanish, which is the #1 request on the part of students. And because we have so many Spanish-speaking families, teachers who can speak Spanish as well. There are a lot of areas where if we just had a sound immigration policy, just a level-headed immigration policy that both parties worked together on, we would solve a lot of problems. When is the day going to come? I mean, is the future positive when we think about sort of rational immigration policy in our country?
I think, well, I feel optimistic. And, you know, I think because I came out of a dark time on the border too, just recently, where I saw our laws just eviscerated and the real human impact that had. But I think that day comes when we find our activism. And you and I and everybody else joining us today, it's not just an issue for immigrant families to grapple with. It's for us to also realize that our civic engagement doesn't end when we vote. It starts when we engage with our communities. You know, it can be something as simple as a municipal ID that really changes the lives of an immigrant mother living in Dallas, for example. So it doesn't just end with comprehensive immigration reform. I think it starts with our minds and how we decide to welcome and embrace our neighbors truly, so that we can all succeed.
And I'll leave us with this thought, is that the driver of our economy in the United States has been our growth, whether that's our own babies or immigration or a combination of both. And when we think about our future and our economic future, if we're going to continue to grow, if we're going to continue to be this big power, immigration has to be a big part of that equation. And we're going to have to figure out, how do we continue to make immigration a part of the success of the United States as much as it's always been, right? And I think that it's just real important that as we look to the future, immigration and children are going to be a natural part of that future. So thank you very much, Linda, for being a part of this little lightning round, as we called it internally. And thank you very much for all the work that you're doing.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Bob.
All righty. Next up on our Future of Children Summit here, we want to go into, and this is our, Cynthia, you're like our big speaker here, because you're the wrap up, you're the cleanup speaker, if you will. Cynthia Osborne is the founder and executive director of Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center. She's out at Vanderbilt University, and we want to talk a little bit about the future of childcare. Cynthia, welcome, and take it away.
Well, thank you. And it's always hard to be the last speaker. I know everyone's time sometimes gets a little itchy at the end, but I'm so thrilled to be able to have be invited and be part of this, and to be part of this whole conversation. If you'll go with me a little bit into the future, I want to imagine myself in 15 years being a professor, teaching my early childhood development and policy course to a group of students who are so excited to go into the field of early childhood education. They see it as a huge kind of endeavor that they are taking on. And their choices were between becoming a teacher, becoming a nurse, becoming a police officer, becoming a public servant. But to them, being this early childhood teacher was something that they felt was so important. And I want to share with you kind of what are the 5 things that I would want them to really know, or what I would try to tell them in this kind of future tense, if you will, about what we've learned over the last 15 years or decade or so. I'm really thinking about how we have created a childcare system that works for everyone, that meets the needs of families, that meets the needs of our economy, but that also meets the needs of our children. So again, 15 years from now, I'm teaching this class. And one of the first things that I want my students to understand is that back in 2023, we had a time in which childcare teachers were deciding between doing something that they loved and caring about and working at Target or McDonald's, not becoming a nurse or a teacher. That the wages that they were paid 15 years ago, in future tense, were sub-living wages and not commensurate with what they deserve. And that the future now is something in which everyone is being paid in a wage that really respects this field. My future students, boy, they couldn't believe that we would pay folks who are doing such important work of developing our children in so many different ways, a wage that was well beneath what they deserved. The next lesson that I really want to kind of take my future students to take away, I want them to be surprised when they hear me talk about how our childcare system and our education system at large was very siloed. Between childcare and pre-K and K-12 and higher ed, and siloed between health systems and human service systems. That childcare was kind of in its own place. We had different rules and laws and regulations and funding and everything that really put K-12 in this special thing in which this is the real deal. This is real school. This is when we really invest in kids. This is when we're really responsible for them. And we had made some good headway over time in saying, oh, 3 and 4-year-olds, okay, we'll make some public investments in then. But the idea of making public investments in our kids from birth to age 3 was something that was really hard for a lot of folks to wrap their head around. My future students are surprised by this because by now, 15 years, these systems are better integrated with one another. And the K-12 system has learned so much from what we know is so important in our birth through 5 space, that we have to center families, that we learn through doing, that we learn through play, that we're born learning, and that there is no more talk 15 years from now that somehow we're supposed to be getting kids ready to learn or ready for school or ready to succeed. They're born learning, and this is a continuum. And our system is not only just aligned with each other so that we're looking at a birth through post-secondary approach, that it's also aligned with the other sorts of systems that serve families, and that we have taken a different approach to the way we do things, and that we've centered the family and their needs, and that therefore centering the child within that family, knowing that the family is the child's first and best teacher throughout their life course, not only in the earliest years. We also have learned that our children cannot learn well if they are hungry or unhoused or in harm's way, and that we are taking into consideration all of those things from birth through all the way through school, where we're doing the types of screenings that are necessary to understand the needs of families, and that we're connecting the families to the resources that can really benefit them. And again, not just asking kids to come to school and leave everything behind, or parents to bring their kids to childcare and go to, just so that they can go to work. We're thinking about this as a system that serves our families. And the other thing that we have learned, hopefully in this 15-year future, is that childcare and education in general is just one element of a system of care that really supports our families. That we've come to understand the importance of having broad-based economic and family supports, and how a paid family leave program helps to not only ensure that children get off to a healthy start and parents have that opportunity to bond with their children early on, but it also alleviates some of the pressure on infant care that is so hard to provide. That we know that with a child allowance or earned income tax credits and living wages, that those things combined make it easier for families to work and to care for their children, and that makes the role of both childcare and kind of education and learning that much richer, that we are able to really support the whole child and help them to develop in the ways that we know that are so crucial for their long-term health and well-being. And that there's also the targeted supports and services that go alongside these more broad-based economic supports. The other thing that we've learned is that childcare is a public good. My future students are shocked that we used to have this system where we tried to dole out a limited number of subsidies to folks who could prove that they were eligible, and we didn't have enough to go around, and providers weren't incentivized to take them because it wasn't enough to cover their costs, and they had to do a lot to get them, and other families could pay more. We've learned that sort of system was broken, a fundamental market failure, to the point that now we have decided that childcare is a necessity, it's a public good, just like K-12 education is. Now, not everyone is going to use childcare from their children's birth or a care setting in that way. And not every care setting is going to be the same. We're going to be responsive to what the families are needing, the times of day that they need care, the types of care that they need, the cultural congruence, the language. And again, our K-12 systems are learning from that too. And I'm hoping that those are all transforming. But that this is something that families can rely on as a way to allow them to work and as a place to help to nurture their children's development. Well, and to just say, that my future students, they understand that back here at this time, subsidies have been an important thing, but they also, I'm able to teach them about how back in the time of around the time of their birth, these students, was this pandemic that revealed to the rest of the world what problems the childcare market was having, but just really exacerbated the existing problems that had existed long before. But it brought a time of unprecedented public spending into childcare. And states were creative and inventive, and they spent it in ways that were really important, that we learned made a big difference. But I want my students to really understand that leadership matters and that elections have consequences, and that there were 2 times in the last 50 years of the United States in which we got really close to doing right by our kids and families. In 1971, Nixon was supportive of universal child care, universal family benefits. It kind of went by the wayside because of Phyllis Schlafly. We also know that in 2021, we came this close to having a Build Back Better bill that would have also provided those long-term supports for families. But we got serious as a community, and we said we have to do something. The American Rescue Plan Act dollars we're going to be going away. We knew that was going to be devastating. And my future students are going to hear about how we rallied and we stood up and said, it's time for us to invest in our children. And we did it. We started to make those investments. And 15 years from now, it's really clear of how all those have paid off. Now, if I could say one thing, I do hope that in 15 years, no one's being asked to justify why we would invest in a 3-year-old or invest in a 1-year-old any more than we ask why we would invest in 2nd grade. But whatever the investments have been, they have paid off. And so, again, my students are going to learn that we know how we can make pathways toward a career in early childhood that has both the pay and the respect that the important job deserves, that they are going to understand that our early learning is just part of a system of over our life course of learning that's well integrated and family-centric. And that childcare and education is just one part of this larger system of care that is so crucial to support all of us, and especially our children. And that we are, as a country, investing in this because we've kind of made that case that children matter. So I'm going to stop there, Bob. I know I got a little utopian on me, but for me especially, but I just needed to go there for a minute.
Well, listen, that's what this is all about, being utopian, right? Dr. Osborne, I want to thank you very much for that. And I love this idea of looking 15 years in the future back. And I wonder if we look at models that are like that. And one of the things I always talk about, right, is that if we look for that academic success in K-12, especially for low-income kids, it starts with extraordinary experiences in early education, right? I mean, if we have a good pre-K, 3, 4, good childcare before that, those kids are significantly more likely to be successful, and they probably won't be as successful if they don't have that quality early education. So when we look at specific instances today, is like the EduCare model that you see where you have early education centers built next to elementary schools. There's a direct tie-in and there's very high quality early education. Is that sort of a model that we should all be looking to as something that could happen in the future?
Yeah, I think that that's a really great idea for that. Because what that does is not just say, okay, you childcare providers, you pre-K teachers, get those kids ready for me, the real teachers, because then I'm going to teach them how to learn. That's kind of the system that we have set up in too many different places. The model that you're talking about says, so children learn from birth, and we need to make sure that we're helping them and to develop their social and cognitive and physical and all the skills that we know go into making us successful and reaching our optimal potential. And those things are integrated, and the family is still the center of it. They're not saying, give us your kids, we're going to fix them, and then we're just going to send them back into some community. They're saying, we are the community. This is the community. And that's the model that will really be successful.
You know, one of the things when people do education in the developing worlds, they go into the developing countries, and what they'll see is that if things are going to change here, we're going to need to make sure that everyone has a free, universally free education. And so that means we're going to have to get rid of the schools. You all are paying to go to the schools. Yet today, our childcare system in America is much like the developing world in terms of education. You know, depending upon where you go, depends upon how much you pay. And you have, and at state legislatures, you have this argument, you're going to eliminate all these small businesses if we try to do more around early education. Yet that is what's indeed best for our kids, not to eliminate the businesses, but to have public education engaged and part of early education, and basically for the government to be a part of this, right?
Yeah, I think that we are always going, just the same way we have private schools, we are always going to have situations or circumstances that families are going to preference over others. And with infants and toddlers in particular, understandably, families want them to be in this kind of warm, kind of family-centered environment. And that's got to play an important role in this whole continuum of care, I believe, of our home-based providers. But that doesn't mean that our home-based providers can't have the support of both kind of curriculum and social development that we know are so important. It also means that there's going to be folks have to follow some sort of guidelines in terms of how you pay your educators, how you train your educators, what it is that you do with the children, if you're going to be able to take the kind of universal benefit that could come for childcare. So, you know, it's a little bit like with public schools now, they have to follow rules and private schools don't. I think we're going to have a mixed market for a very long time. But I don't think that we have to put businesses out. They don't have to go out of business. They just have to have more support in doing the work that we know is so necessary for children's development.
Yeah, exactly. And states that have had these robust full day pre-K4 programs are sort of an example of the way things can work. You don't have to go to the public school, right, but they're still good. If you can't afford to do childcare, you can still do a very high quality pre-K4 program.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, states are able to have it where your pre-K 4 or 3 is in your local childcare center rather than in your local elementary school. Yeah. And that might be the right mix too, right? That we don't have the space right now if we wanted every kid under age 5 to come into a public school. But there are we can make it so that you are getting a quality education that is a benefit that is helping the family and the community and our economy, without making it so that every kid is sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day.
Yeah. I want to end with one other point that you pointed out, which was paid family leave and, you know, sort of engaging the family in this. And people often say, well, this sounds socialist to me. And I will point out there's only one other country in the whole world that doesn't have paid family leave, Papua New Guinea. And if you think we have to really emulate Papua New Guinea, you know, there are plenty of other better examples. And I also remember, and this will seem extreme, visiting a country in Europe, Sweden, which I mentioned earlier, where they said, oh yeah, we get 18 months of paid family. And at that point I thought, well, that seems a little much, doesn't it? But when you look at the research, it's pretty clear that what happens with a parent and child during those 18 months, very important to the success of that child.
Yeah, the evidence around paid family leave is just so strong in terms of not only, you know, what it does for work, it's actually one of the most pro-work policies that we have. It allows families to take some time, but then return to employment. And they're not stressed and scrambling to figure out how they're going to get back to work in 2 weeks or have to quit because they have to take time off to care for a child who has become ill, as all infants do. It actually is pro-work, and it is so great in terms of additional bonding and allowing parents the time to do the things they want to do, of getting their kids immunized and to the doctor and trying to breastfeed and so forth. Yeah, we're the only country that doesn't do this. There are now 13 states that will, but it's a necessary part of this continuum of learning.
Yeah. Dr. Cynthia Osborne, she is the founder and executive director of the Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center at Vanderbilt University. Thank you very much, Cynthia, for being with us.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it. Thanks for the whole event.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end. We do have a survey for you guys that will be dropped in the chat. We want to make sure that you evaluate this. Tell us what you'd like to see. We're developing our schedule for the rest of the year and next year. What are some of the summits that you would like to see happen? Some of the issues that you'd like to see us cover? What would you like to see covered in next year's Future of Children Summit that we do? And so our next one is the Immigration Summit coming up. And so you can sign up for that. I know Linda Corchado will be front and center. So if you really enjoyed listening to her, she'll be a part of this. Tell us who did well. Tell us who didn't do well in terms of some of the speakers. We want to hear about that. And most importantly, we want to make sure that you also, like so many others that are part of this, spend time working on behalf of children and working behalf on our future. Because, of course, children are our future. If we make the world better for children, we're making the world better for us. So thank you guys very much on behalf of Children at Risk, the Texas Family Leadership Council, Corebridge, and all of our partners. We thank you very much for being a part of this. And we look forward to seeing you next time for children.